The morning bells of Nexus 7 rang across the crystalline spires of the Galactic Military Academy, their haunting melody echoing through corridors filled with beings from dozens of worlds. Kara adjusted her translucent form as she floated toward Professor Hartwell's classroom, her silicate body catching and refracting the artificial sunlight that streamed through the massive windows. Behind her, Vex moved with the fluid grace of his 6 arms, each limb carrying different study materials, while his main eyes focused ahead and his secondary eyes scanned for threats that would never come in this peaceful place. The Advanced Strategic Combat course was considered the most challenging class at the Academy, reserved for only the brightest minds from across known space. Students who entered this room represented the future military leaders of their respective species, each one handpicked from millions of candidates. They came from worlds where warfare had been refined to an art form over thousands of years, where strategy was taught alongside mathematics and philosophy. Professor Hartwell stood at the front of the classroom, tall and imposing in his full environmental suit. The silver material gleamed under the lights, completely concealing whoever was inside. A voice modulator gave his words a mechanical quality that somehow made his lectures more mysterious than informative. Students had spent months speculating about their professor's true identity, but the Academy's records listed only his credentials and his species as classified for medical reasons. Today we begin our study of primitive species integration, Professor Hartwell announced, his modulated voice carrying clearly through the room. Specifically, we will examine how less developed civilizations have managed to survive first contact with superior galactic powers. Dreen, a lumen whose energy form pulsed with barely contained excitement, brightened noticeably. Professor, surely you mean how they've been absorbed or eliminated by superior powers. Integration implies they maintain some form of independence. Interesting assumption, the professor replied, touching a control panel. The room's walls transformed into a 3-dimensional display showing a small blue-green planet orbiting a yellow star. This is Earth, home to a species that achieved galactic contact merely 30 years ago? By all measurements, humans should have been easily conquered or absorbed into existing power structures. The classroom erupted in barely suppressed laughter. Kara's crystalline form chimed with amusement as she processed the absurdity. Humans, she said, her voice like wind through crystal caverns, are perhaps the most limited species we've encountered. Single heart, single brain, no natural weapons, fragile bone structure, and lifespans barely reaching a century. Nexia, the class's Mindari representative, nodded her elongated head in agreement. Her pale blue skin shimmered as her telepathic abilities unconsciously probed the emotions of her classmates, finding unanimous agreement. Their cognitive processing is linear rather than parallel. Their memory systems are notoriously unreliable, and they require constant chemical intake to maintain basic functions. From a military perspective, they represent everything we've learned not to be. Professor Hartwell moved closer to the display, his suited form casting long shadows across the projected Earth. Yet humans not only survived first contact but maintained their independence. They currently control 17 star systems and maintain active military forces that other species respect. Respect? Vex's 4 main arms gestured dismissively while his auxiliary arms continued taking notes. Professor. With respect, fear and respect are different concepts. Humans are unpredictable because they're primitive. Other species maintain distance not from respect but from concern about contamination or accidental conflicts with beings who don't understand proper diplomatic protocols. The professor turned to face Vex directly. You believe unpredictability stems from primitiveness? Obviously, Dreen interjected, his energy form pulsing brighter. Advanced species develop optimal strategies through mathematical modeling and logical progression. Humans stumble through situations using trial and error, emotional responses, and worst of all, instinct. They're essentially sophisticated animals operating on biological programming rather than intelligent thought. Kara accessed her memory banks, displaying holographic data above her crystalline structure. Human military history consists primarily of massive resource waste through direct confrontation. They fought over territory, ideology, resources, and even abstract concepts like honor. Their wars have killed billions of their own species, destroyed irreplaceable infrastructure, and set back their development by centuries at a time. Their tactics are equally primitive, Nexia added, her telepathic abilities detecting growing amusement from her classmates. Humans rely heavily on overwhelming force, surprise attacks, and what they call shock and awe strategies. They prioritize speed over planning, aggression over negotiation, and individual sacrifice over collective preservation. Professor Hartwell remained silent for several moments, his environmental suit revealing nothing of his thoughts or reactions. Finally, he spoke. These are fascinating observations. Tell me, how would your respective species have handled the siege of Stalingrad? The display changed, showing a winter landscape of destroyed buildings and frozen ground. Data streams appeared alongside the images, detailing troop movements, casualty figures, and resource expenditures that made several students recoil in shock. "This is barbaric," Dreen whispered, his energy form dimming as he processed the information. Humans fought for months in sub-zero temperatures, eating rats and shoe leather, using ammunition that was more valuable than food. They continued fighting when rational analysis clearly indicated the position was unsustainable. Vex studied the tactical display with all 6 arms working simultaneously, processing different aspects of the battle. Any civilized species would have negotiated a strategic withdrawal within days. The resource cost alone makes this engagement economically impossible to justify. Humans lost over 1 million beings for a city that could have been rebuilt elsewhere. Yet they won, Professor, Hartwell noted quietly. They survived, Kara corrected, her crystalline form resonating with certainty. Survival isn't victory when the cost exceeds any possible benefit. A proper species would have calculated the optimal outcome and worked toward it efficiently. Nexia nodded in agreement, her telepathic senses detecting unanimous support from her classmates. Humans mistake stubborn refusal to accept reality for strength. They call it determination, but it's actually a fundamental inability to process. Cost-benefit analysis under stress. The professor moved to another section of the display, highlighting different battles throughout human history. The Battle of Thermopylae. 300 Spartans against hundreds of thousands of Persians. The Alamo, 200 defenders against several thousand attackers. Cameroon, 65 soldiers against 3,000. All defeats, Dex pointed out smugly. All remembered, the professor replied. Dreen's energy form pulsed with confusion. Remembering defeats serves no strategic purpose. Civilized species study victories to replicate successful strategies and minimize failures to avoid repeating mistakes. Humans celebrate their defeats more than their victories, Kara observed, accessing her extensive database of human cultural information. They create monuments to battles they lost, write songs about soldiers who died, and teach their children to honor those who failed to achieve their objectives. Because, Nexia added, her telepathic abilities picking up the emotional resonance her classmates felt toward this topic, they fundamentally misunderstand the purpose of military action. War should be the continuation of politics by other means, not an emotional expression of cultural values. Professor Hartwell stood motionless for a long moment, his environmental suit reflecting the light from the tactical displays. I want each of you to select one human military engagement from the database and prepare an analysis of how your species would have achieved the same objectives more efficiently. We'll discuss your findings tomorrow. As students began accessing the military database, the professor added almost as an afterthought, pay particular attention to engagements where humans faced numerically or technologically superior opponents. The classroom filled with the quiet sounds of different species, working Kara's crystalline chimes as she processed data, Vex's soft clicking as his multiple limbs operated various interfaces, Dreen's energy fluctuations as he absorbed information, and Nexia's barely audible humming as her telepathic abilities helped her understand the emotional context behind military decisions. None of them noticed that Professor Hartwell stood perfectly still throughout their research, watching them with whatever eyes lay hidden behind his environmental suit's dark visor. None of them wondered why he seemed so familiar with human military tactics, or why his questions always seemed designed to defend human strategies rather than critique them. The morning bells rang again, signaling the end of class, and students gathered their materials while discussing how easily their respective species would have dominated human opponents. As they filed out of the room, their conversation centered on the amusing primitiveness of human warfare and the obvious superiority of civilized military doctrine. Professor Hartwell remained alone in the empty classroom, surrounded by holographic displays of human battles, his environmental suit revealing nothing of his thoughts as he watched the tactical data scroll past. 3 days of research had only reinforced what the students already believed about human military capabilities. Kara floated into the classroom with her crystalline form practically humming with anticipation, data streams visible within her translucent structure as she prepared to demonstrate the obvious superiority of silicate tactical thinking. The other students showed similar confidence as they took their positions around the holographic display table that dominated the center of the room. Professor Hartwell activated the room's advanced simulation systems, and suddenly the sterile classroom transformed into an immersive battlefield environment. The sense of gunpowder and mud filled the air, while distant sounds of artillery created an atmospheric backdrop that made several students shift uncomfortably in their seats. Your assignment was to analyze human military engagements and propose superior alternatives, the professor announced, his modulated voice cutting through the simulated battlefield sounds. Kara, please present your analysis of the Battle of Britain. The silicate student's form brightened as she accessed her prepared presentation. Holographic displays materialized around her, showing aircraft formations, resource calculations, and tactical probability matrices. The human response to aerial bombardment was fundamentally flawed, she began, her crystalline voice ringing with certainty. They dispersed their defensive assets across hundreds of small airfields, instead of concentrating them at strategically optimal locations. Data streams flowed through her translucent body as she continued. A silicate defense network would have calculated the most efficient interception patterns and positioned all aircraft accordingly. Instead of sending small groups of fighters against large bomber formations, we would have assembled overwhelming force concentrations at mathematically determined intercept points. Dreen's energy form pulsed with agreement. The humans also wasted enormous resources on emotional gestures like defending non-strategic targets. Churches, hospitals, schools, none of these locations provided military value, yet humans diverted defensive assets to protect them. Worse, Vex added, his 6 arms manipulating different holographic displays simultaneously. They allowed individual pilots to make tactical decisions during combat. Proper coordination requires centralized command with real-time optimization. Algorithms. Human pilots often broke formation to pursue personal targets or assist damaged wingmates, reducing overall mission effectiveness. Professor Hartwell moved among the students, his environmental suit reflecting the projected battlefield imagery. These are detailed analyses? Nexia, what did you discover about human psychological warfare? The Mindari student's pale blue skin shimmered as she organized her thoughts. Humans consistently make decisions based on emotional rather than logical frameworks. During the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, they chose to fight despite having no possibility of military victory. From a telepathic perspective, their motivation stemmed from concepts like dignity and honor rather than strategic objectives. Her elongated head tilted as she accessed specific memories from her research. The entire engagement could have been avoided through proper negotiation and resource allocation. Instead, humans chose mutual destruction over logical compromise, resulting in massive casualties and infrastructure damage that served no rational purpose. Kara's crystalline form chimed with amusement. The most absurd example I discovered was the Christmas truce of 1914. Human soldiers from opposing armies stopped fighting to exchange gifts and play games together, then resumed trying to kill each other the next day. No civilized species would allow such emotional inconsistency to interfere with military objectives. The professor touched his control panel, and the classroom environment shifted to display a frozen battlefield with soldiers emerging from trenches. To meet in no man's land. You find this behavior illogical? Completely irrational, Green responded, his energy form fluctuating with what might have been laughter. Military effectiveness requires consistent application of force until objectives are achieved. Humans interrupt their own strategies for meaningless social rituals. Vex gestured toward the display with multiple arms. The time and resources spent on this truce could have been used for reconnaissance, fortification, improvement, or equipment maintenance. Instead, humans wasted combat readiness on activities that provided no tactical advantage. Professor Hartwell paused the simulation and faced the students directly. You've all provided excellent analysis of human inefficiency. Now I want you to experience these battles firsthand through our combat simulation system. The classroom transformed into a full immersion environment where students found themselves placed in various historical human military situations. Kara discovered herself in the cockpit of a primitive aircraft, her crystalline body adapting to unfamiliar controls as enemy planes approached through cloudy skies. Vex found his 6 arms struggling to operate simple mechanical weapons while crammed into a muddy trench that restricted his natural coordination abilities. This equipment is impossibly crude, Kara transmitted to her classmates as she attempted to track enemy aircraft using basic visual targeting systems. How did humans achieve anything with such primitive tools? Dream materialized beside a human artillery position, his energy form barely contained within the simulation's physical parameters. These chemical explosives are so inefficient compared to directed energy weapons. Humans used hundreds of shells where a single plasma burst would have been more effective. The simulation intensified as students faced increasingly desperate battlefield conditions. Nexia found herself overwhelmed by the simulated emotional intensity of human soldiers, fighting without her species' telepathic coordination abilities. I can't understand how they function without direct mind-to-mind communication, she gasped, struggling to process individual verbal orders while under attack. As the exercises continued, something unexpected began happening. Despite their technological superiority and advanced capabilities, the students found themselves struggling to achieve the objectives that historical human forces had accomplished. Kara's perfect memory and processing power couldn't compensate for the crude targeting systems and unpredictable weather conditions that human pilots had somehow managed. Vex's superior coordination became useless when confined to primitive trenches designed for bipedal creatures with only 2 arms. Professor, Dream called out as his energy form flickered with frustration. These scenarios are unfairly constrained. We're being forced to use inferior human equipment and tactics instead of applying our natural advantages. The humans used the same equipment, Professor Hartwell replied quietly. But they were adapted to these limitations, Kara protested, her crystalline structure resonating with irritation. We're being asked to fight with deliberately handicapped capabilities. Every species has limitations, the professor observed. What matters is how effectively you work within them. The simulation shifted to the Battle of Stalingrad, and students found themselves in a frozen hellscape where survival itself became a constant struggle. Vex discovered that his multiple arms were a disadvantage in cramped urban combat, where quick movement through narrow spaces was essential. Nexia realized that her telepathic abilities became overwhelming liabilities when surrounded by the desperate thoughts of starving, freezing soldiers. "This is impossible," she whispered, her pale blue skin turning almost white as she experienced the simulated emotional trauma of prolonged siege warfare. How did humans maintain any semblance of military organization under these conditions? Green's energy form dimmed as he struggled with the concept of fighting while gradually starving. Their supply lines were completely severed, their equipment was failing, and reinforcements were impossible. Any rational species would have negotiated. surrender to preserve resources and personnel. Yet the humans held the city. Professor Hartwell noted. Kara accessed her memory banks frantically, trying to find logical explanations for human tactical decisions. They continued fighting even when mathematical analysis clearly indicated that their position was hopeless. This represents fundamental flaws in their decision-making processes. The professor moved through the simulated battlefield. His environmental suit somehow perfectly adapted to every scenario. Or perhaps they understood something your mathematics didn't account for. What could possibly justify continuing a battle that cannot be won? Vex demanded, his frustration evident as he struggled with primitive human weapons. That depends, the professor replied, on how you define winning. The simulation ended abruptly, leaving students standing in the sterile classroom once again. But the experiences lingered in their minds: the desperation, the impossible conditions, the inexplicable human refusal to accept defeat even when logic demanded surrender. Tomorrow, Professor Hartwell announced, we'll examine battles where humans faced opponents with superior technology, numbers, and capabilities. I want you to consider why species that should have easily defeated humans often found themselves in prolonged conflicts or outright defeats. As students filed out of the classroom, their conversations were noticeably more subdued than before. The easy mockery of human primitiveness had been replaced by genuine confusion about how such limited beings had managed to achieve anything at all, let alone maintain their independence in a galaxy full of superior species. Professor Hartwell remained alone with the simulation controls, surrounded by holographic displays of human military history. His environmental suit revealed nothing as he studied battle after battle where humans had somehow found ways to win despite every logical indicator suggesting they should have lost. The Academy's most advanced simulation chamber hummed with energy. As Professor Hartwell made final preparations for what he had described as a special exercise, unlike the classroom's standard holographic displays, this facility could create completely immersive experiences that affected all senses and even simulated physical stress and injury. Students had used it before for training scenarios, but never for historical analysis of primitive species warfare. Kara floated near the chamber's entrance. Her crystalline form, reflecting nervous energy as data streams, flickered more rapidly than usual through her translucent structure. Professor, the simulation chamber seems excessive for studying human military history. These systems are designed for training future galactic commanders, not analyzing primitive tactics. Perhaps, Professor Hartwell replied, his modulated voice carrying an edge that hadn't been present in previous classes. The distinction between those two activities isn't as clear as you assume. Dreen's energy form pulsed with anticipation. Are we finally going to demonstrate how advanced species would have handled these human conflicts? I've been developing optimal strategies that would have resolved their primitive struggles in days, rather than years. Something like that, the professor answered, though his tone suggested a different agenda. Today you'll face scenarios based on actual first-contact conflicts between humans and various galactic powers. These engagements occurred approximately 20 years ago during humanity's initial expansion into contested space. Vex shifted position, his 6 arms automatically checking his equipment while his multiple eyes scanned the chamber's sophisticated systems. Professor, with respect, those conflicts were hardly worth studying. Human victories against proper galactic forces were statistical anomalies, usually involving miscommunication or underestimation by commanders who didn't expect serious resistance from such a primitive species. An interesting theory, Professor Hartwell said, activating the chamber's initialization sequence. Let's test it. The simulation began with what appeared to be a straightforward tactical scenario. Students found themselves aboard a Hexa Alliance battlecruiser approaching a human-controlled asteroid mining facility. Their mission was simple: demand human withdrawal from the system and enforce compliance if necessary. Intelligence reports indicated the facility was defended by a small garrison with outdated weapons and no significant space assets. NEXIA immediately accessed the tactical situation through her telepathic abilities, coordinating with her classmates. to develop an optimal approach strategy. "The human position is completely indefensible," she reported. 37 personnel, minimal fortifications, no escape routes, and weapon systems that are decades behind our current technology. Kara processed the available data through her crystalline matrix, calculating probability outcomes with perfect accuracy. Mathematical analysis indicates a 97% probability of human surrender within 6 minutes of our ultimatum. Their rational response would be immediate evacuation to preserve personnel. The simulation began exactly as predicted. The Hexa battlecruiser approached the asteroid facility, transmitted standard surrender demands, and waited for the expected human compliance. Instead, the asteroid's weapon systems activated and began firing on the vastly superior alien vessel. "This is irrational," Dreen transmitted as his energy form flickered with confusion. "They're attacking us with weapons that can't possibly damage our shields. Why aren't they surrendering?" Vex coordinated the battlecruiser's response with efficient precision, using his multiple arms to manage different weapon systems simultaneously. "We'll disable their defensive positions and wait for them to recognize the futility of resistance." But something went wrong with the expected outcome. The human weapons, while primitive, were being used in ways that the simulation's tactical computers hadn't anticipated. Instead of firing at the battlecruiser's shields, human defenders targeted specific system components, communication arrays, and sensor nodes with surgical precision that shouldn't have been possible with such crude equipment. "How are they achieving this targeting accuracy?" Kara demanded, her crystalline form resonating with frustration as human missiles somehow bypassed their defensive algorithms. The answer came in the form of something no civilized species would have attempted. Human defenders launched themselves into space wearing nothing but basic environmental suits, manually guiding primitive explosives toward critical ship systems while enemy fire tried to stop them. "They're committing suicide," Nexia whispered, her telepathic abilities overwhelmed by the emotional intensity of beings who had chosen death over surrender. "I can sense their thoughts. They know they won't survive, but they're continuing anyway." "This is impossible," Vex protested as his carefully coordinated weapon systems fell victim to human kamikaze attacks that ignored every tactical doctrine he understood. "No rational being sacrifices themselves for a position that cannot be held." "Professor." Hartwell's voice echoed through the simulation chamber. "Yet they're holding it?" The scenario escalated as more human defenders emerged from hidden positions throughout the asteroid. They fought with improvised weapons, jury-rigged explosives, and tactics that seemed to defy logical military thinking. When they're organized, resistance collapsed, individual humans continued fighting alone, using mining equipment as weapons and turning industrial accidents into deliberate attacks against alien forces. Dreen's energy form began fluctuating erratically as he tried to process the emotional and tactical chaos. "Professor, this simulation must be malfunctioning. These humans are behaving in ways that contradict basic survival instincts." "The simulation is accurate," the professor replied coldly. "The first scenario ended with the human facility destroyed and its defenders dead, but the Hexa battlecruiser had suffered significant damage and lost nearly half its crew to what should have been a simple enforcement action." Students stood in the simulation chamber's aftermath, their confidence noticeably shaken by the experience. "That was an anomaly," Kara insisted, her crystalline structure still resonating with stress patterns. "One isolated incident of human irrationality doesn't represent their typical military response." "Let's find out," Professor Hartwell said. Initializing the next scenario, the second simulation placed students aboard a Mindari exploration vessel that had encountered human ships in a disputed star system. The engagement should have been even more straightforward than the first Mindari telepathic coordination and superior technology against human vessels that were outgunned, outnumbered, and operating far from any support, but humans adapted their tactics in ways that neutralized Mindari advantages. They used broad-spectrum communication jamming that interfered with telepathic coordination. They employed random movement patterns that made their intentions impossible to predict. Most disturbing of all, human crews seemed completely immune to the fear-based psychological warfare that normally caused enemy forces to retreat. "They're not responding to our deterrent broadcasts," Nexia reported, her pale blue skin trembling as she struggled to understand minds that functioned so differently from her own. "I can sense their fear, but they're not acting on it. They know. They're likely to die, but they continue following orders anyway." The human ships attacked with the same relentless determination the students had witnessed in the asteroid scenario. They used their vessels as weapons when ammunition ran out, ramming alien ships despite certain destruction. They continued fighting, even when their ships were crippled, turning emergency systems into improvised weapons and using life support equipment to create explosive traps. By the third scenario, students were no longer making jokes about human primitiveness. The simulation placed them in ground combat situations where human infantry faced alien forces with superior numbers, equipment, and physical capabilities. Yet somehow, humans consistently found ways to neutralize these advantages through tactics that bordered on insanity. "They're using their own wounded as decoys," Vex reported with growing horror as he watched human soldiers deliberately exposing injured comrades to draw enemy fire, then launching counterattacks from unexpected angles. "They've turned their supply depot into a massive bomb," Dreen observed, his energy form dimming with shock. "They're willing to destroy their own resources to deny them to us. They won't surrender even when we offer them terms," Nexia added, her telepathic abilities detecting human thoughts that prioritized abstract concepts like honor and duty over survival itself. Each scenario ended the same way with human forces, technically defeated but having inflicted such devastating casualties and psychological trauma on their opponents that victory felt more like defeat. Students found themselves dreading each new simulation as they experienced firsthand what it meant to fight an enemy that refused to follow rational tactical principles. Professor Hartwell stood at the chamber's control center, his environmental suit reflecting the chaotic light from multiple battlefield displays. These scenarios are based on actual engagements from the First Contact Wars. Every human response you've witnessed was documented by survivors from your respective species. The chamber fell silent except for the hum of cooling systems as students processed what they had experienced. Their casual dismissal of human military capabilities had been replaced by something approaching genuine fear. "Professor," Kara finally spoke, her crystalline voice barely audible, "how did the galactic powers eventually defeat humanity if their resistance was so intense?" "Who told you humanity was defeated?" the professor asked quietly. The question hung in the air like an accusation as students realized they had assumed something that might not be true. They looked at each other with growing unease, beginning to understand that their lessons about primitive human warfare might have been built on fundamentally incorrect premises. The simulation chamber's emergency protocols activated as Nexia collapsed to the floor, her pale blue skin flickering between normal coloration and an alarming white that indicated severe telepathic overload. Her elongated limbs trembled uncontrollably while her mind struggled to process the emotional intensity of what Professor Hartwell had called the final scenario, the Battle of Terra's Moon. "Medical assistance required in Simulation Chamber 7? Kara transmitted automatically, her crystalline form resonating with distress frequencies as she tried to help her classmate. The Mindari student's telepathic abilities had been overwhelmed by the simulated thoughts of human defenders who continued fighting despite injuries that should have incapacitated any rational being. Dreen's energy form flickered erratically as he attempted to maintain coherence while surrounded by the chaotic aftermath of virtual warfare. "Professor, this exercise has exceeded safe parameters. We need to terminate the simulation immediately." But Professor Hartwell made no move toward the control systems. His environmental suit stood motionless as the chamber continued displaying the horrific reality of humans defending their home system's primary military installation. "The simulation will continue until completion," he announced, his modulated voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. Vex discovered that 4 of his 6 arms had frozen in place, paralyzed by indecision as his sophisticated coordination. Systems failed to process tactical situations that defied every strategic principle he had learned. "This isn't training," he whispered, his remaining functional limbs trembling. "This is psychological torture." The Battle of Terra's moon had begun 6 months earlier in simulation time, with overwhelming alien forces surrounding a human defensive position that military mathematics declared impossible to hold. The moon's fortifications consisted of hastily constructed bunkers, improvised weapon emplacements, and defensive positions that violated every principle of proper military engineering, yet somehow, human defenders had held their ground for over half a year against forces that should have overrun them in days. Students watched in growing horror as virtual human soldiers continued fighting with broken equipment, improvised weapons, and injuries that would have sent any civilized being to medical care immediately. Their eating ration paste mixed with recycled water, Kara observed, her perfect memory recording details that her logical processes couldn't understand. Their ammunition reserves were exhausted weeks ago, yet they continue manufacturing crude explosives from mining equipment and industrial chemicals. The simulation forced students to experience the battle from multiple perspectives as attacking alien forces who found their superior technology neutralized by human ingenuity, and as human defenders who refused to acknowledge the mathematical impossibility of their situation. Nexia regained consciousness just long enough to scream before collapsing again, her telepathic abilities overwhelmed by the intensity of human thoughts that prioritized duty and sacrifice over self-preservation. "I can feel them dying," she gasped. "They know they're dying, but they won't stop fighting." Professor Hartwell moved closer to the collapsed Mindari student but made no attempt to assist her. "What are you sensing from their thoughts?" "They're not thinking about victory," Nexia whispered, her voice barely audible. "They know they can't win. They're thinking about buying time for evacuation ships, about making the cost too high, about proving something to enemies who consider them inferior." Dreen's energy form continued to flicker as he struggled with concepts that his species had never needed to understand. They're fighting for abstract principles rather than concrete objectives. This represents fundamental cognitive malfunction. Or, Professor Hartwell suggested quietly, it represents something your species has never learned to value. The simulation entered its final phase as human defenses gradually collapsed under relentless alien assault. Students expected the defenders to surrender once their position became untenable, but instead witnessed something that challenged every assumption about rational behavior. Human soldiers began deliberately triggering explosive devices that destroyed strategic positions, rather than allowing them to fall intact into enemy hands. Medical personnel fought alongside combat troops instead of treating wounded. Engineers sabotaged their own equipment to prevent alien forces from using captured technology. "They're destroying everything rather than let us have it," Vex observed, his frozen arms finally beginning to respond as the simulation neared its end. "Even their own people, they're setting off explosives in areas where human wounded are located rather than allowing them to be captured." Kara processed the tactical data flowing through her crystalline matrix, but for the first time in her existence, mathematical analysis failed to provide clear answers. The resource destruction alone represents decades of human industrial output. They're eliminating infrastructure that took generations to build rather than preserve it through negotiated surrender. The Battle of Terra's moon ended as the simulation's historical records indicated, with the human position finally overrun after 6 months of resistance that cost attacking forces nearly 60% casualties. The moon's surface had been transformed into a wasteland of craters and debris, its strategic value eliminated by defenders who chose destruction over defeat, but victory felt hollow for students who had experienced the battle's psychological impact. They stood in the simulation chamber's sudden silence, their confidence in the superiority of civilized warfare permanently shattered by exposure to human tactical thinking. "The casualty ratios don't make sense," Kara finally spoke, her crystalline voice carrying notes of confusion that her species rarely experienced. "Humans lost the battle, but attacking forces suffered losses that should have forced them to withdraw weeks earlier. Dreen's energy form had stabilized somewhat, but his usual brightness remained noticeably dimmed. Professor, these simulations represent historical anomalies. Surely most human military engagements followed more conventional patterns. These weren't anomalies, Professor Hartwell replied, his environmental suit reflecting the chamber's emergency lighting as medical personnel arrived to assist Nexia. These were typical human responses to overwhelming force. Vex used his recovered arms to access historical databases, searching for evidence that would restore his understanding of proper warfare. There must be examples of humans surrendering when faced with superior opponents. No species fights to extinction in every engagement. You're correct, the professor acknowledged. Humans did sometimes surrender. The students felt momentary relief until he continued, usually after killing at least half their attackers and destroying anything of strategic value. The medical team carefully removed Nexia from the chamber, her pale blue skin still flickering with signs of telepathic trauma. Her whispered words echoed in the artificial silence. They don't think like us? They don't think like anyone. Professor Hartwell deactivated the chamber's systems, but the holographic displays continued showing statistical analyses of human military performance during the First Contact Wars. The data revealed patterns that challenged fundamental assumptions about primitive species integration into galactic civilization. Your species, the professor said, addressing the remaining students directly, all developed on worlds where intelligent life was the dominant force. You evolved in environments where cooperation and negotiation provided optimal survival strategies. He paused, allowing the significance of his words to register. Humans evolved on a planet that spent millions of years trying to kill them. They developed survival strategies based on the assumption that everything in their environment was actively hostile. Kara's crystalline structure resonated with a frequency that indicated deep confusion. Professor, what species are you? Your knowledge of human tactical psychology exceeds anything available in standard academic databases. The question that had been whispered among students for months was finally spoken aloud. Professor Hartwell stood motionless in his environmental suit, surrounded by holographic displays of human battles and the aftermath of exercises that had psychologically traumatized some of the galaxy's most promising military minds. That, he said quietly, is an excellent question. His hands moved to the seals of his environmental suit, and for the first time in months, students saw their professor begin to remove the protective gear that had concealed his identity. The helmet came off first, revealing weathered features and gray hair that spoke of experience in ways that no amount of academic study could provide. Then the bodysuit, showing scars from old wounds and the lean build of someone who had survived battles rather than merely studied them. My name, he said in an unmodulated voice that carried the weight of personal experience, is Colonel James Hartwell, formerly of the Terran Defense Corps. The simulation chamber fell completely silent as students stared at the human who had been teaching them about warfare for months. Colonel Hartwell stood before them without his environmental suit, revealing the physical reality of the species they had spent so much time analyzing and dismissing. Kara's crystalline form went completely dark for several seconds as her processing system struggled to integrate this new information with everything she had believed about their professor. You're human, she whispered, her voice barely registering on the chamber's audio sensors. I was there, Hartwell continued, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had lived through the battles they had just experienced in simulation. Terra's moon, the asteroid campaign, the defense of the outer colonies. I commanded human forces against every species represented in this classroom. Dree's energy form flickered weakly as he processed the implications. You've been teaching us about human military tactics because you developed them. I helped develop them, Hartwell corrected. Human military doctrine isn't the product of individual genius, it's the accumulated wisdom of a species that learned to survive in a universe that wanted them dead. Lex finally managed to coordinate all 6 arms again, but instead of displaying his usual confident efficiency, He used them to steady himself against the chamber wall. Professor Colonel, why? Didn't you tell us? Why the deception? Hartwell's scarred features showed something that might have been amusement. Would you have listened if you'd known your instructor was a member of the primitive species you were so eager to mock? The question hung in the air like an accusation because all of them knew the answer. They had spent the first weeks of class dismissing human military capabilities based on preconceptions about primitive species. Learning that their professor was human would have only reinforced their belief that the course was being taught by someone inherently inferior. The simulations, Kara said slowly, her crystalline structure beginning to show faint light patterns again. You weren't showing us historical scenarios for academic analysis. You were showing us battles you fought in. Battles my friends died in, Hartwell added quietly. The Terra's moon scenario that overwhelmed your classmates' telepathic abilities? I was there for all 6 months. I watched soldiers with injuries that should have been fatal continue fighting because they knew evacuation ships needed more time. He moved to one of the holographic displays, showing casualty figures from the Battle of Terra's moon. The defenders you saw in simulation weren't acting irrationally. They were buying time for 3 million civilian refugees to escape the system. Every day they held that position meant another transport convoy reached safety. Dreen's energy form pulsed with what might have been understanding. The resource destruction, the refusal to surrender strategic positions, you weren't fighting for the moon itself. We were fighting for the principle that humans don't abandon their own. Hartwell replied. Every species in this galaxy has conquered weaker neighbors by demonstrating overwhelming force and expecting rational surrender. Humans taught the galaxy that some species consider rational surrender to be a contradiction in terms. Vex access. His memory banks, reviewing months of classroom discussions with new understanding. Your questions, your defense of human tactics, you weren't playing devil's advocate. You were watching us mock strategies that kept your species alive. And I was evaluating whether the next generation of galactic military leaders would repeat the mistakes their predecessors made 20 years ago, Hartwell said. The same mistakes that turned what should have been simple primitive species integration into the bloodiest conflict in recorded galactic history. The chamber's emergency lighting cast strange shadows across the holographic battlefield displays, creating an atmosphere that matched the students' growing realization of how fundamentally they had misunderstood both their professor and his species. Colonel, Kara said, her crystalline voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity rather than condescension for the first time. What was it like? Fighting against forces with superior technology and numbers? Hartwell was quiet for a long moment, his eyes focused on tactical displays that showed battles he had lived through rather than studied. Terrifying, he admitted. Every engagement began with the knowledge that we were outgunned, outnumbered, and probably going to die. But we also knew that surrender meant our families, our children, our entire species would be absorbed into someone else's empire. He touched a control panel, bringing up images of human colonies that had been evacuated during the war. So we fought in ways that made victory too expensive to achieve. We made every battle cost more than our enemies could afford to pay. We turned human stubbornness into a strategic weapon. The truth settled over the students like a weight they hadn't expected to carry. Their months of analyzing human military failures had actually been lessons in how a supposedly inferior species had fought the galaxy's greatest powers to a standstill and earned their independence through sheer determination. Tomorrow, Colonel, Hartwell said, beginning to gather his environmental suit, we'll discuss why understanding your enemy's true motivations matters more than calculating their apparent capabilities. The next morning brought an unusual quiet to the advanced strategic combat classroom as students filed in with none of their previous confidence. Kara's crystalline form moved slowly, her usual bright data streams replaced by subdued patterns that reflected deep contemplation. Vex entered with uncharacteristic hesitation, his 6 arms moving independently rather than in their typical, coordinated fashion. Dreen's energy form maintained a dimmer glow than normal, while Nexia's pale blue skin still showed, faint stress patterns from her telepathic overload during the previous day's simulation. Colonel Hartwell stood at the front of the room without his environmental suit, appearing fully human for the first time since classes began. The scars on his weathered face told stories of battles fought and survived, while his gray hair spoke of decades spent in military service. Without the artificial modulation of his suit's voice systems, his words carried the authority of someone who had earned his knowledge through experience rather than academic study. Yesterday's revelation appears to have affected your normal classroom dynamics, he observed, his unmodulated voice filling the space that had previously echoed with confident alien superiority. I suspect you have questions. Kara's crystalline structure resonated with uncertainty as she processed the implications of everything they had learned. Colonel, we spent months analyzing human military tactics as examples of primitive inefficiency. How many of those battles were you personally involved in? Most of them, Hartwell replied without hesitation. The siege of Stalingrad was before my time, obviously, but every scenario from the first contact wars came from my direct experience or that of soldiers under my command. Vex used 2 arms to access his personal notes while the other 4 fidgeted with nervous energy. We mocked human decision-making processes, called them irrational and emotionally driven. Were we wrong about those assessments? You were partially correct, Hartwell admitted, moving to stand among the students rather than maintaining the formal distance typical of academy instructors. Human military decisions are heavily influenced by emotional factors that most species would consider irrational. He paused, allowing that admission to register before continuing. But you failed to understand that emotion can be a strategic advantage when properly channeled. Fear of failure motivated human soldiers to fight beyond their physical limitations. Anger at injustice gave them strength to continue when logic demanded surrender. Love for their families made them willing to die to protect people they would never see again. Dreen's energy form pulsed with confusion. But emotion introduces variables that cannot be calculated or predicted. How can unpredictability be considered a strategic advantage? Because, Hartwell replied, your enemies were making the same calculation error you just demonstrated. They assumed that superior firepower and logical tactics would produce predictable results against an inferior opponent. They never considered that humans might refuse to follow the rules of rational warfare. Nexia shifted position carefully, her telepathic abilities still recovering from the previous day's trauma. Colonel, when I sensed the thoughts of human defenders in those simulations, their minds were unlike anything I had encountered. They seemed to embrace concepts that my species would consider mental illness, such as the willingness to die. For abstract principles, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. The ability to function effectively while experiencing terror. The tendency to form emotional bonds with fellow soldiers that override self-preservation instincts. Hartwell nodded with what might have been approval. You've identified some of humanity's greatest strengths, though you're interpreting them as weaknesses. Humans developed those psychological adaptations over millions of years of evolution on a world that was actively trying to kill them. He activated the room's display systems, showing images of Earth's prehistoric landscapes filled with predators, natural disasters, and environmental hazards that would have eliminated most galactic species before they achieved intelligence. Ice ages that lasted hundreds of thousands of years, volcanic eruptions that blocked sunlight for decades, asteroid impacts that eliminated dominant life forms, predators that hunted in coordinated packs, diseases that could wipe out entire populations. Humans survived all of this by developing one crucial ability that most species never needed. Which was? Kara asked, her crystalline form reflecting. Genuine curiosity. The capacity to continue functioning when survival seems impossible, Hartwell replied. Every other species in this galaxy evolved on worlds where intelligence provided a path to safety. Humans evolved on a world where intelligence was just another tool for postponing inevitable death. Vex processed this information through his multiple cognitive systems, trying to integrate it with everything he had learned about proper military doctrine. That explains human tactical unpredictability, but it doesn't justify the resource waste we observed. Humans consistently chose costly victories over efficient compromises. Because, Hartwell said, moving to a tactical display that showed casualty figures from various human conflicts, humans learned that there are things worse than death. Slavery, subjugation, cultural extinction, these concepts motivated human resistance more effectively than any promise of victory. He highlighted specific battles where human forces had fought against overwhelming odds. Every species that encountered humans during first contact assumed we would follow standard primitive species protocols, submit to superior technology, accept tributary status, gradually integrate into galactic civilization while abandoning our independent culture. That is the normal pattern, Dreen observed, his energy form stabilizing as he engaged with familiar concepts. Primitive species lack the resources to maintain independence against advanced civilizations. Integration benefits both parties by avoiding unnecessary conflict. Unless the primitive species refuses to be integrated, Hartwell replied quietly. Humans looked at your offer of subordinate partnership and decided we would rather die free than live as anyone's junior partners. The weight of that statement settled over the classroom as students began to understand the fundamental miscalculation their respective species had made 2 decades earlier. They had assumed humans would follow rational patterns of behavior when faced with superior opponents, never considering that humans might define rationality differently than every other known species. Kara's crystalline structure chimed with a frequency that indicated profound realization. The first contact wars weren't about territory or resources. They were about whether humans would be allowed to remain human. And we fought them the only way we knew how, Hartwell confirmed. With absolute determination, tactical flexibility, and the willingness to pay any price necessary to maintain our independence. Nexia looked up from her meditation position, her pale blue skin showing healthier coloration as her telepathic abilities recovered. Colonel, what happens now? Humans have proven they cannot be conquered through conventional military action, but they remain significantly outnumbered by galactic civilization. Now, Hartwell said, we learn to coexist. Humans have earned a place at the galactic table, not through superior technology or advanced culture, but by demonstrating that some species cannot be forced into submission regardless of the odds against them. He moved back to the front of the classroom, his scarred features showing something that might have been satisfaction. Your assignment for tomorrow is to reconsider every assumption you've made about what makes a species dangerous in military terms. Focus specifically on the difference between capabilities and determination. As students began gathering their materials, Lex raised one arm hesitantly. Colonel, will you continue teaching this course as a human, or will you return to using the environmental suit? Hartwell considered the question seriously. That depends on whether you're prepared to learn military strategy from a member of the species you spent months dismissing as primitive. The silence that followed was different from the uncomfortable quiet of recent days. It carried the weight of genuine respect earned through revelation rather than demanded through authority. We would be honored to continue learning from you. Colonel, Kara said, her crystalline voice ringing with sincerity. Though I suspect our education is going to be significantly more challenging now that we understand who our instructor really is. Good, Hartwell replied with the first genuine smile his students had ever seen. Because tomorrow we begin studying the one military concept that every species in this galaxy needs to understand. Never underestimate an enemy who has nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. As students filed out of the classroom, their conversations carried a tone of respect and curiosity that had been absent throughout their months of study. They were no longer the same overconfident beings who had mocked human military capabilities, and they would never again make the mistake of assuming that superior technology guaranteed victory against an opponent who refused to accept defeat. Colonel Hartwell remained alone in the empty classroom, surrounded by holographic displays of battles he had fought and won through determination rather than superiority. Tomorrow would bring new lessons about the nature of military strength, But today had achieved something more important. It had taught the galaxy's future leaders that the most dangerous species in the universe might be the one everyone assumed was harmless.